It's really nice to be here. I used to teach down the block at UCLA. Amazingly, this is my first visit to USC, although my sister-in-law went to film school here. So I've been hearing about USC for a long time. And it's great to be back in LA for sure. So we'll be talking today about this recent book on healthy politics. It's a book co-authored with Alan Gerber at Yale and Connor Dowling at the University of Mississippi. You should feel free, of course, to jump in anytime with questions. So the motivation for the study, how did I, as a political scientist, and Alan Gerber is political scientist, Connor Dowling, how did we get involved with this? The topic I'm talking about is one that's really mostly been studied by health services researchers and health economists, but we're political scientists and trying to bring a different lens. And what really motivated our attention in the first place was this remarkable study in 2002 published in New England Journal of Medicine that found that a common surgical procedure, arthroscopy for osteoarthritis of the knee, worked no better than an operation in which the surgeon merely pretended to operate. So this was a very common procedure. Older Americans that would have knee pain, difficulty with functioning, would tend to get the surgery before full knee replacement. And in this amazing New England Journal of Medicine study that received attention in the media, what it found is that the people who got the real surgery actually had improvement. They felt better. And they had improved functioning. But the people who got the fake operation had the exact same level of improvement in pain reduction and ability to walk stairs and so on. So for us as political scientists, we were blown away by this. We just didn't know what to make of this. We had never heard of such a thing. It had never occurred to us that this would have been possible, and we were very curious about it. So we started looking at this case, and this was some years ago. And what we found is we did an in-depth case study, and that experts said that 80 to 90% of these treatments should not be done. There were a few exceptions, but in general, this was a treatment that didn't have a strong basis in scientific evidence. And we were curious as what would happen if something like this occurs. If you get a study like this, how does the health care system react? And what we found is that the orthopedic medical societies did their best to try to discredit the study. They raised a number of methodological concerns about the study. Most of them were not particularly persuasive. They went to Washington to lobby the CMS, the Medicare agency, to maintain funding and coverage of the study. They called for a replication, which is reasonable. It was only one study. But they made no effort to actually raise the resources or mobilize effort to try to make sure that any lingering doubts about the study were quickly resolved. Eventually, and there was no immediate impact on clinical practice. Eventually, the number of these procedures did go down over time, but at the same time, surgeries for a closely related procedure for meniscal tears went up fast. In some ways, it looked like, although it's difficult to tease out in the data, that at least some physicians didn't so much change their behavior, but changed their coding pattern and started coding what they were doing for coverage and reimbursement a little differently, but were basically doing the same procedure on more or less the same population group. And then later on, in 2013, there was another randomized controlled, placebo-controlled trial that found this other procedure also worked no better than sham. So this was a remarkable sort of case study. It was only one case study, but it raised many questions about the performance of the American healthcare system. This is not the only one like this. Recently, in 2017, there was a blockbuster study published in The Lancet that found essentially that heart stents for people that have chest pain, angina, that in the population where all the patients in the study were treated by optimal medical therapy, the patients that in addition got a heart stent had no more pain relief than patients who got a fake procedure. So once again, here's a very common procedure that has not been able to demonstrate superiority over a placebo intervention. I should note that my colleague Alan Gerber and I were arrested by this cardiac study as well. So we got together, we held a conference at Yale last year that brought together leading cardiologists, including the Darrell Francis, who is the lead PI on this study, as well as the editor of JAMA Internal Medicine and other leading experts to talk about the study. In brief, it was a very similar kind of dynamic where the heart associations, rather than the medical societies representing cardiologists, rather than welcoming this evidence as an opportunity to improve their scientific knowledge and improve their care for patient, treated this as an attack on the profession. And they were extremely defensive. We published recently, just this last week, blogs from that workshop in Health Affairs, if any of you are interested in reading what the cardiologists and healthcare experts think about this episode. This was a cartoon that appeared in one of the newspapers after the original knee surgery, saying it looks like I've had an operation. Well, that's the main thing. So the reason, of course, that we're talking about this is these cases are fascinating in their own right, and they're certainly important for orthopedic patients and cardiac patients, but it offers a window into a much, much broader phenomenon, and that might be called the medical evidence problem. Some experts believe that less than half of all medical care in the United States is based on adequate scientific evidence about what really works best for patients. Many treatment options have never been compared head-to-head against alternatives. So say there's a medical condition and you might be able to treat it with drug therapy, or maybe with a surgical operation, or maybe with physical therapy. As a patient, you would want to know what treatment is really best. As a payer, we might want to know. But oftentimes that information simply does not exist. One reason is that there's no FDA for surgery. We think of the FDA as part of the best part of the scientific basis of medicine, but in general, the FDA, I'm simplifying here, is mostly looking at drugs and devices and mostly asking the question of whether a particular drug works better than a placebo, and it's often on some surrogate endpoint that may or may not be causally closely related to the medical outcome of interest. It does not necessarily look at FDA review, is A better than B, and it especially doesn't look at, is drug A better than surgery B, if there's two alternative pathways. That key information that we need to know to make sure that patients get the highest quality care and that we spend our scarce healthcare dollars cost effectively, we often lack that information. Yes?
Yeah. The FDA is an interesting issue because if you look at the way drugs get approved, and even devices as well, they'll do a narrow, very homogeneous protocol with a well-defined population. If you look at that shams surgery, for example, that was people who had osteoarthritis with no other complications. So there's no question the surgery is valuable for people who don't just have knee pain. They have more complicated injuries to the knee. So the history of technology here often is one where it gets approved in a population where it is therapeutically beneficial. The problem is it then gets covered in these marginal populations that are much larger. Anyone with knee pain. So for complicated knee, there's no question surgery helps. You can just look at the NFL for that. If I tore my, but for uncomplicated cases, which are actually 80 to 90%, like you said, the issue is, so I don't understand how the FDA helps here because approval is based on these narrow, the issue is not approval of the ability. We can't do upstream rationing. Or maybe you're going to say that. The issue is coverage and payment for when the evidence doesn't support it.
Great points. Two things. I think actually you're previewing my next slide a little bit about one of the problems. But even in the knee case, there is, of course, I should have said, I'm not talking about all knee surgery, right? And I'm also not talking about all heart surgery. If I fall over the next 10 minutes, please, and I have a heart attack, please call the hospital and get me some stents, right? Because I've had a heart attack. So, but the key, I don't want to make it too sweeping, but in the knee case, for example, one of the arguments that was made was by the orthopedist is, it does work for particular other populations, those with mechanical symptoms, and actually they were wrong about that. So the real question is, for what subgroups does any given treatment work? And in fact, just as you've said,
I want to point out that the FDA does not do that. Does not, neither FDA nor CMS.
Even for drugs.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's
Once
always.
They approve it. So when Avastin was approved for metastatic colorectal,
then it starts to diffuse broadly.
They were using it for glioblastoma.
Absolutely right. So that's my second bullet point here, actually. So sometimes entire classes of care are inappropriate, but the more common problem is exactly what you just said, and that is that it's inappropriate in some cases and appropriate for other patient subgroups, and the US medical system is particularly poor at discriminating. And so what we often do see is something where it is an expensive procedure, might make sense for a particular patient group, but there's nothing that prevents physicians from starting to use it on many, many different patients for whom there is no strong evidence of efficacy, and that can be very expensive. So that's That is the dynamic that is the more common one, for sure. Exactly what you said. It's difficult to talk about how expensive this is. Some estimates $200 billion problem. What I think is important is, this is not really a cost control problem per se. It is, but if you look in cross-national perspective, the main reason why the U.S. spends more than other countries is our prices are higher than in other countries. This is really about a quality and safety and cost effectiveness issue. So if you care, yes, if you care about controlling healthcare costs, you might be thinking about some of these issues. But if you care about making sure that you get the best care and your mom gets the best care, and if we want to make sure that whatever our given budget is for healthcare, that we're trying to get the most medical bang for the buck for it, then I think you have to think about some of these issues. So we think this is, as political scientists, we think the fact that the knee surgery case could happen or the heart stent could happen should be seen as a puzzle. Why should it be seen as a puzzle? Because this problem is affecting on a daily basis the well-being of millions and millions of Americans, right? Now, some things are not so surprising. If we see drug and medical device companies trying to suppress studies or attack studies that might say that their products are not as good as advertised, that's not particularly puzzling. But if we are spending hundreds of billions of dollars annually in services that are useless or at best offer low value for money, it's a puzzle. Now, as was already alluded to, this has been recognized. The Obama administration pushed a comparative effectiveness research initiative to try to create more taxpayer support for studies like this. But it was a very, very modest initiative, and we'll see if it even lasts. The agency's funding is expiring in 2019. So what the book is really about is, how does this equilibrium persist? How could we see, year in and year out, common procedures used without a strong evidence base? How could we see, year in and year out, when studies do come out, they're often ignored by medical societies? What are the political forces, in other words, that sustain an equilibrium that seems not to be promoting the diffuse public interest in having evidence-based information about what works best for patients? Sir.
Say you have a bunch of attorneys who notice this and decide to go to patients who've been hurt by the surgery and then use the studies that the FDA had done to show that it's very good for some people, but there's no good evidence for everybody else.
So I'm not a medical malpractice expert, but I think the basic answer to your question is, can we rely on the medical malpractice system in a way, in litigation, to solve this problem? And the answer is basically no, because to simplify, what medical malpractice generally looks at is this doctor practicing in a way that's consistent with the norms of his or her professional community? This is a failure not of an individual doctor that's deviating from the norms. This is a problem of the profession as a whole not being based on evidence-based practices. And the medical malpractice system is not set up to correct the medical profession's failures of collective self-regulation. It's set up to make sure that individual physicians comply with the norms of their colleagues.
So let me just follow up on that, because one interesting question, and I was on the CBO's panel that was trying to quantify the benefits of legislation that would change medical malpractice. One of the questions was, suppose you change that standard to you had to show that there was evidence to support what you did.
That'd be different, yeah.
What would be the effect? Does anyone know? CBO had no way to score it.
Yeah, that was Orzag. I think that was one of his favorite initiatives, and didn't really get in the ACA.
It's hard because Democrats take a lot of money from lawyers.
Yeah, so it was also, some of the interviews that I saw suggested that there was the hope that the medical societies would push for that reform during the ACA debate, and they didn't. Instead, they focused their scarce political capital on Medicare reimbursement issues. So they could have, actually. I don't know how much it would save, but that would be a revolutionary change to the way our malpractice systems works, which would be much more consistent with the policy analysis I'm giving here, I think. Yes?
Another possibility is to treat the medical societies as corrupt institutions. I forgot what you would call them, and their recommendations as being self-serving.
Yeah. So
and
if
you go
you
after them, a very nice big, target.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a lot about these issues, but I would say in the Health Affairs blog symposium that I just edited, you can find online, Rita Redberg, the editor of JAMA Internal Medicine, basically, she's a physician, not my words, her words, she basically says this in print. So there are some reformers within the medical profession that are making that argument.
Hungry lawyers. I'm not talking about, the hell with the profession.
Well, if we have to rely on a battle between lawyers and doctors to fix this, I'm not so optimistic. Okay, so the puzzle deepens about why does this political equilibrium persist? What's going on here? I think it becomes more puzzling when we're recognizing that experts recognize this, and the failure to generate and disseminate and use medical evidence, it harms all Americans. This is a sad fact about the American political system. If I told you, here's a problem, and it only affects marginalized groups, it only affects poor people, unfortunately, that's not so puzzling. We know how the American political system works. It is more puzzling when we find wealthy people with good insurance plans that want the best medical care, and they're going to Cedars-Sinai, and they might still get something that doesn't work so well. That should be a little bit of a puzzle. We can't just say that this is a distributional issue. This is something systemic that affects every single American. Other OECD nations have created health technology assessment agencies that have some linkages to policymaking bodies. We have not been willing to do that so much. And also, and I think this is really important, evidence-based medicine is not an issue like redistribution. This is not an intrinsically ideological or partisan issue. Who believes in evidence-free medicine, right? Oh, nobody really believes in that. And historically, if you go back in time, both Republican and Democratic associated health economists, they all thought this was a problem. They all thought this was something we should be doing about it. And yet, as I will talk about in a minute, the whole issue has become incredibly politicized. Yeah.
Do you think there's any role for reputation? Like if this is not such a partisan or ideological issue, say reputation among orthopedic surgeons, do you think that there's a role for reputation to play a role? It sounds like not, but why not?
Well, I think part of the reason is the structure of public opinion and how they think about doctors that makes it very hard to change unless doctors themselves lead in this effort. But
reputation doctor to doctor.
Yes, I think there is some hope for that. Yes, I do think that peer effects and peer leadership could be a mechanism. I agree. I do think that is a mechanism that could be hopeful. I think that's one possible avenue of change. Okay, so to give you a sense of what this book does, so basically that's the puzzle that as political scientists, we're trying to ask the very basic naive question, like what is going on, why does this problem persist, and why has there not been a more adequate response? And so the book looks at three sets of actors. We're simplifying. Obviously, healthcare is incredibly complicated, but we focus on three actors: the public, physicians, and politicians. We think any analysis needs to pay attention to those actors at least. We investigate the public through opinion surveys and survey experiments. We investigate physicians through a national physician survey, and politicians through survey experiments and cases and historical institutional analysis. So let me tell you a little bit about our findings along each of these dimensions. So first of all, the public. We performed a bunch of national public opinion surveys over time. These were internet-based surveys, sample sizes 1,100 to 3,600, and these kinds of surveys are used routinely in political science and found to be as good, if not better, than these days phone surveys and some other mechanisms. So matching and weighting techniques are used to generate a sample representative of the US population. And we also were able to show that our samples were similar to surveys on baseline questions about things like what percentage of our sample has health insurance, what percentage of the sample is in good or poor health, and so on, that it mirrors the US population. The core finding we find, the single most important thing we find, is that the public looks to doctors on these issues. The public does not trust government. The public does not trust pharmaceutical firms. The public does not trust health insurers. The only actors that the public trusts really is doctors. Now, a lot of the literature has focused on the decline in public confidence, which is true. In 2010, for example, 34% of Americans said they had a great deal of confidence in the people running medicine compared to 73% in 1966. That's not so surprising, really, since decline in everything has gone down. And maybe the military is the one sort of big exception. But there's been an erosion of public trust in all institutions, all professions. What really matters for political influence is relative standing. And so relative to all the other actors in the healthcare arena, doctors still do pretty well. The trust, and this trust, we argue, that the public have in doctors as medical healers leads to a broad-based social trust in doctors as policy experts and faithful representatives of the public welfare in general. So there's kind of this positive spillover effect. People trust their doctor to take care of them, and they also kind of think like doctors know best about health care in general. And for example, we ask people, who do you think, would you trust to recommend the right thing for reforming U.S. healthcare? Medical doctors do the best. I was glad that professors came in a healthy second, but doctors win that battle. So we're really, basically drawing on a simple principal agent model here of how the public thinks. Of course, doctors have, a kind of charismatic and emotional appeal. They'd have to. You're sitting there in your underwear. You're going to kind of have the faith in these people, but it's beyond that. What principal agency theory suggests is what makes people persuasive is if people believe that the person sending information is an expert, and if you believe that the person who's giving you the information shares your interests, wants the best for you. And that's how people think about doctors. They think of people, their agent, as doctors, as genuine experts who really are trying to recommend the best thing for you, the patient. So they not only know best, but they're motivated to do the right thing for patients. So we asked some other questions, and you can see, compared to lawyers, and school teachers, and of course members of Congress, we couldn't resist that one, even though that's like shooting fish in a barrel. People think that doctors work harder and longer, that they're more interested in helping people. This is the big difference between doctors and lawyers. Look how much more people think that doctors are motivated to assist people compared to lawyers, that they're less interested in prestige than lawyers, they're more empathetic, they care more about people like you, and that they can be trusted, right? So of our elite professions, the doctors do the best in mass opinion. The other thing that I think we did not necessarily expect, but I think is really important, is you might think that people only have these warm feelings about their individual doctors. And remember the case that I just described at the beginning about the knee surgery case and the heart case. When we looked at the way the medical societies in those instances behaved, they behaved just like lobbyists. They behaved just like any interest group. They made arguments. Some of them were persuasive, some not, but that's what they did. They went to Washington, they made arguments. Does the public see medical societies essentially as trade associations? And the answer is they don't. So the warm feeling that people have for their individual doctors spills over to organized medicine. People think that medical societies are less interested in maximizing income than unions and businesses, less interested in preserving influence, a little less interested in ensuring new laws and regulations, more interested in promoting patient worker health. The one where people do see is on malpractice. People do think medical societies are very focused on protecting doctors against malpractice suits. Yeah.
Did you happen to ask, I noticed that you had members of Congress and teachers and doctors
Yeah.
in your last one. Did you happen to ask, split out the teachers' unions as opposed to just unions as a whole?
Oh, that's a good point. We did not.
So one of in that principal agent problem, you point out the trust that the agent has your interests at heart is quite important. One of the ways the arrow's shown that gets done is through licensure.
Yes.
And one issue here is that people believe that they go and they train. Yep. This ophthalmologist has been in school for 23 years.
And they have their license.
And they have their license, so I'm going to believe in the quality. So did you ask about the licensure part? Because these professional societies are also licensing people.
Yeah, no, we did not. It's a great question. I think you're probably right. I don't have data to back that. But why do people think that? I don't know how much thought the ordinary person gives to that, but they probably do think, well, they're in school a long time, and not anyone can be a doctor, and somehow that process protects patient welfare. I think that is sort of the intuition.
But I guess one way to get at that, by the way, is trust of doctors versus nurses or nurse practitioners or some other.
Nurses
are also licensed, but
nurses actually do very well. So nurses are trusted. I don't think they have the level of influence, but when it comes to trust, nurses rank very, very high. Very high. Okay, so what do we find here? This was from a health affairs piece we published from this project a couple of years ago. In general, the American public is, because they trust doctors so much, they are very anxious about anything, any policy change that looks like it's getting between you and your doctor. They want that personal relationship with the doctor, and any policy or reform that would mediate that makes them nervous. Now, when we give people arguments for why we might want to have evidence-based guidelines that doctors would have to follow, you can get some agreement with that. Like if we say to the public, well, maybe doctors are affected by economic incentives and that could lead doctors to give unnecessary care, or requiring doctors to follow guidelines to improve care. Doctors in a given area may be unaware that a better treatment exists elsewhere. You can see people think it's, there's something there. But in politics, what really matters is intensity. That's what drives opinion. And it's the arguments against this that people find very, very convincing. Arguments like, so you can see in the blue is the percentage of the public that finds a particular argument very convincing. No outside group should come between doctors and patients in making treatment decisions. Doctors will be unable to tailor care. Government insurers are just going to use treatment guidelines as a way to control costs and ration care, and so on. What Americans of all stripes are very, very opposed to is any kind of board. Any kind of board that would mandate or even clearly recommend this is the best treatment for back pain, for knee surgery. People do not like that. So overall, this is very unpopular. It was more unpopular among Republicans than Democrats, but not very popular among anybody. The other thing that I think is important to see is part of the unease with any kind of evidence-based guidelines is Americans start, a majority of Americans, from the assumption that there are cures out there and I want them, and do not stop me from having them. So this was kind of remarkable that 55% of respondents agreed modern medicine can cure almost any illness with advanced technology and treatment. Not everybody, but a majority of Americans believe that almost anything can be cured if you would just get the best possible treatment. This was an interesting finding. We asked people, what do you think about the evidence basis of your medical care? Do you think the care you get is backed by evidence? And what we found is that men think that 60% of men think that most of the care they get is backed by evidence. Of course, they think they're getting better care than other people. They think only 53% of them think that other people's care is based on evidence. Women were less confident that medicine is based on sound evidence. So only 41% of women think that their care is evidence-based, and 34% of others. And this gender difference actually holds up when we control for lots of other things. I don't know what explains the gender gap. There are a couple possibilities here. Maybe women actually just have more contact and knowledge about the medical system because they're caring for children and their elderly parents. They may just see more than men do. They may know more. Maybe there's a belief that women are underrepresented in clinical trials, and so they are more likely to think that those scientific findings won't apply to me. Or maybe my favorite answer is that men are just sort of insane and susceptible to the illusion of control, and they think anything that touches them is sort of good, and nothing bad really could happen to them. So we were also interested in this project to look at what kinds of policies would the American public accept or reject. And in brief, Americans are nothing but good consumers. So the more that we give people information, the happier they are. Would people like information about whether a given treatment works better than alternative ways of treating patients with the same condition? Yeah, people love that. But as you move down the menu of reforms, the more we start using the information to mediate resource allocation, or to say somebody somehow might not have something, the less people like it. Even the last one, would people be okay with charging a patient more to get a treatment that research has not shown to be effective if their doctor recommends it? People do not like that. So notice in this case, we weren't saying you can't have the treatment. We're just saying, oh, you want this treatment, your doctor wants to give it to you. There's no evidence for it. This is really expensive. You could still have it. You're just going to pay higher premium for it because it's not based in sound science. People don't like that. Their view is, my doctor says I need it. That's it. No one else should be making any decisions on any other basis. And the public fears are really easily stoked. So this was a survey experiment where we gave people randomized the order in which people were exposed to arguments pro and con, having support for comparative effectiveness research. The pro arguments were like, well, these studies are going to help improve healthcare outcomes, or this can help reduce the deficit by cutting wasteful medical spending. The reason why all of them are negative is no matter what order in which we expose people to this, then the anti-arguments are always stronger to people. So the arguments, this is just going to lead to cookie cutter, one-size-fits-all medicine, just going to lead to healthcare rationing. fears are really, really easily stoked when it comes to this stuff. Now, can we overcome these fears? Can we build public support for reforms to move to a more evidence-based system? The answer is the main mechanism that we found is physician leadership, going back to trust in doctors. If we tell people, doctors support this reform, doctors think we should move to a system like this, we can overcome that. All the other arguments like, oh, this is just a scare tactic, or actually having studies about the average patient is really useful, or we can actually design research studies to look at subgroups, that's nowhere near as effective as simply telling people, doctors say we should do this. That's the best argument you can make in healthcare.
Is that true for Medicare? Did the AMA support the passage of Medicare and Medicaid?
Oh, no, that was then for sure. But I'm going to show you another survey experiment where we use the AMA, and I can show you that still will move opinion in a positive way. So maybe that's now. I think you're being amazing at like anticipating every slide 2 slides ahead of time. Here we go. A survey experiment here that looks at the effects of physician and partisan cues on support for proposal to reduce healthcare. So we just tell the public in this survey experiment, here's a proposal to reduce healthcare costs. We don't even give it content. We just say it's a proposal to reduce healthcare costs. And then we randomize what cues people get. So some of the people get no AMA cue. We don't even mention the AMA. Some people we say the AMA says it's good. Other people say the AMA thinks it's bad. And then we have a variety of political endorsements. Like we tell some people Republicans think this is good, or Republicans think it's bad, or Democrats think it's good, or Democrats think it's bad, or both parties think it's good, and so on. And we're trying to measure, would different cues from these partisan groups and the AMA, does that change support for your willingness to support this proposal? Yes?
And these were done in that same time frame from December of 2009?
Oh, when, yes.
Something 2011, like November 2011?
I could have to look in the book. I don't remember if it was 11 or 12. It's around in that. Well, this was in one of the 5 or 6 national surveys we did. Okay, so here's a complicated chart, but let me summarize it for you. If you're a Democrat, and I tell you, Democrats say this is a good idea, you say okay. And if I tell you you're a Democrat, Republican thinks it's a good idea, you don't like it. If you're a Republican and I tell you Republicans say it's a good idea, you like it. If I tell you Democrats think it's a good idea, you don't like it. If I tell you both parties think this is a good idea, that doesn't do anything. We're a 50-50 country, so the 2 parties like balance each other out. The only thing that will move everybody is the AMA in this case. So the only cue that can get overall public opinion to move is, and the difference between me telling you that the AMA supports it or doesn't is, and this was a 0.41, which was significant at the 0.001 level. It was quite significant. So the physician cue makes a big difference. So here was another one. In this survey experiment, we're looking at support for allowing the government and insurers to not pay for stuff that isn't based on evidence. If I tell you leading doctors think this is a good idea, that will increase political support. Somewhat to our surprise, if we told people patient advocacy groups think this is a good idea, that had no impact. Again, it's doctors here. And of course, you saw this coming a mile away. If we tell the public that top drug companies and government administrators think this is a good idea, support goes down. So that was about the public. Actor 2, doctors. So market failures in medical financing, uncertainty, imperfect information, asymmetry, the famous Canaro article already mentioned before, says that reliance on these professional norms, that's part of the way we're trying to protect patient welfare, overcoming these market failures, right? Licensure, the profession itself can be seen as a response to these market failures. But what we have to remember is that professions are not only neutral responses to market failures, they're also political entities, right? They can use the delegated authority that we're giving physicians in exchange for protecting the social welfare. They could use that authority to serve other interests, right? They could use it to their authority to distract or encourage or limit and inform public recognition and deliberation over social problems. So medical societies, yes, are in a way solving this economic problem, but they're also political entities, and we have to understand them as such. And to summarize a lot of history very, very quickly, the American medical regime, we're not unique in the US in having doctors or medical societies who try to protect their professional authority and clinical autonomy, but the individualistic diffusion of medical authority in the US is somewhat unique. We have a historical legacy of federalism, not just a national board. We have relatively weak state licensure regimes, and we have, as one scholar said, professional eclecticism and resistance to standardization. We give that individual physician a lot of authority. We don't have top-down control as much as some other medical systems. And physician services are increasingly paid out of tax dollars, but we really haven't increased public authority to regulate doctors in response to how much taxpayer money now pays for. Right? Before Medicare and Medicaid, there wasn't a big federal presence in regulating doctors. Now, our dollars are paying for doctors, but we haven't really given the government authority to sort of say, what are you doing with our dollars? Are you really getting good value for it? And one survey, for example, a much larger proportion of US physicians compared to their Canadian and Norwegian physicians strongly agree, I have the freedom to make clinical decisions that meet my patients' needs. So doctors today do complain a lot about insurance companies and red tape, and that's true. I think it is much more difficult to be a doctor in the US today than in 1955. I should say I had a line originally in the book that it's no longer the Marcus Welby era, but my younger co-author Connor Dowling said, who's Marcus Welby? So I had to strike that line, making me feel extremely old. Now, I think this was your point about like peer effects. There is a kind of movement within the medical profession of reformers, people that are trying to expose the flaws of US medicine. Today's medical reformers are seeking to raise awareness of industry influence, the need for better stewardship of healthcare resources, widespread failure of doctors. That's Atul Gawande, Jerry Avorn, and others. And I think that movement is in medicine today more than it was 40 years ago, for sure, but it's still a battle. It's still an uphill battle. Surveys show many doctors are reluctant to embrace responsibility for cost. They blame everybody else but themselves. There have been some efforts like Choosing Wisely, where different medical societies will identify the use of unnecessary treatments in their own practice areas. That's great. That's like an exercise in professional responsibility, but it's not had much impact. A lot of those societies picked sort of unimportant, not very expensive procedures. When they put it on the list, it doesn't change behavior very much. And then my favorite example, some societies pointed to the use of unnecessary treatments by other societies, not by themselves. So we performed a physician survey to try to learn more about this. This was 2015. We had an N of 750. We learned the hard way that you cannot get doctors to take surveys unless you pay them. We tried the first time. We thought Yale letterhead might do the trick. Maybe if we put it on UVA letterhead back then, it would have worked, but Yale didn't. So then we ended up having to staple $20 bills to our survey. We got a response rate of 50%, which is pretty good, actually. Of course, that means that half the doctors in the survey kept the 20 and did not send back the survey. But they do seem to be sort of the representative of American physicians. So what did we find? There has been a tremendous amount of research on what's called regional variation in medicine, how doctors in one part of the country might be performing in ways for the same condition very different than others. People at Dartmouth Institute have done a lot of research on this. I think it's got a lot of attention as part of the Affordable Care Act debate. CBO, others have talked about this. What we found is self-reported knowledge. 1 in 2 doctors in our survey had never even heard of this. Had never even heard of this research, this health services research. And of the doctors who did report they knew about it, less than half said they were very familiar. When we were looking at which of the doctors that do know something about this stuff, it was the doctors who expressed that they have a high level of interest in politics, they had done their residency training at a VA, they'd been in practice longer. We were sort of surprised by that. We thought younger doctors who might have been more recent from medical school might have been exposed to some of this, but it was actually more senior doctors, or if they were affiliated with an academic medical center. They were more likely to know about research on this. And of course we were using this for illustrative purposes to see basically about whether doctors are up to speed on the policy debates about this. we were trying to learn how ordinary doctors think about their medical societies. And we said, how important do you think each of these goals should be to, say, the American College of Cardiology, the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, and so on? You'll see that ordinary doctors want a lot of things from their medical societies. They certainly want disseminating best practices, but they also want, to a high level, protect the clinical autonomy of physicians in my areas of practice. And what they are not very enthusiastic about is identify physicians in our area of specialization who are not following best medical practices, bring them to the attention of disciplinary boards. That is not very popular. So that self-regulation mechanism is not something that has a lot of support among doctors.
Did you ask about advocating with the insurance companies? So part of the tension is with you have guidelines there, and they think they should be promulgating guidelines. There are guidelines that are being produced on the other side
By
insurers.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
We didn't ask specifically about that.
View that as one of the roles of the professional societies.
We didn't. That's a good point. I can give you a little bit more purchase on some of these issues by this next question, which was, remember again what we saw in the knee case, in the stent case, these medical societies going to Washington lobbying. But those are the leaders, right? We wanted to know, is that behavior what ordinary doctors want, or are those just sort of, the leaders of medicine of just sort of pushing very aggressively? And so we asked ordinary doctors, suppose a leading medical journal publishes a new study, widely covered in the media, that calls into question a treatment that's commonly used in your practice area. The evidence suggests that the treatment might not be as effective as previously thought. Would you support or oppose each of these responses by your society in response to that study? The one that was by far the most popular is take an active role in critiquing the quality of the study and point out any weaknesses of the study. So when we see medical society leaders basically playing an attack dog role against studies, we don't see any evidence that that behavior is inconsistent with the preferences of their members of their societies. Ordinary doctors are comfortable with having their leaders do that, for sure. Third actor, politicians. So government has not really performed great in this area. We think the policy case for promoting evidence-based medicine is strong, but the government's performance has been really disappointing in two ways. First, between the 70s and 2000s, if we look at the history, politicians didn't do very much in this area. There just wasn't a lot of effort around this, not a lot of entrepreneurship, not a lot of bill introduction to try to identify and eliminate wasteful, low-value services. And then the second kind of disappointment, when the Obama administration, kind of surprisingly, focused their attention on these issues as part of originally the stimulus bill and then the Affordable Care Act debate, in part because Peter Orszag and others were involved. So that was a window of opportunity that they used to move these ideas. And this, again, was an idea that had support among experts associated with both parties. Then what happened was the issue became very politicized. Republicans accused the administration of rationing and interfering with the doctor-patient relationship. So first it was ignored, and then it got caught up in broader partisan politics. So we also want to shed some light on these dynamics. So there's two stages of government failure here, at the agenda setting stage and at the decision making stage. At the agenda setting stage, we often think of American politics as having kind of self-correcting, equilibrating properties. Like, okay, it might go off course, but eventually, dynamics are going to fix itself. There could be an opening for a political entrepreneur, right? Somebody's going to be able to make their reputation by identifying a problem, running on that issue, getting a campaign going, and pointing it out, and they would be able to build a reputation. But there was really not very much entrepreneurial effort among members of Congress. Public choice studies of government failure tend to focus on sins of commission, wasteful spending and so on. But that literature often doesn't look at the sins of omission. Why aren't we seeing this effort to come forward to correct this problem? Why is there too little problem-solving activity in government? So we developed this idea of zero-credit politics to explain why a social policy that might have really large social benefits might not have very large political benefits. There can be a disjunction, in other words, between what is socially optimal and what is politically optimal for the would-be entrepreneur. You could think about a policy innovator, somebody who has to shift public opinion to build support for an idea, as somebody who's making a risky political investment, right? They have to decide. They only have so much time. They can only do so many things. Where am I going to invest my scarce energy and time? And if this investment goes bad, their reputation might suffer. Now, In a commercial setting, let's say you're in the private sector, if you invest, you might be able to patent your idea. I've got a new idea for this new good, and you can patent that. But in politics, you can't easily patent ideas. So if I'm investing all my time and energy, well, if it's a really good idea, somebody could come in and steal my idea, and I could have done all the hard work, and maybe they'll even do better because now they can see the reactions that my idea generated, and they can tailor the idea a little bit better. And if that kind of dynamic is successful, well, why would I ever invest in the first place? I would have no incentive to do that. And the incentive for lawmakers to engage in entrepreneurial activities to address problems might be especially weak if you have to go and challenge trusted groups like doctors. If I have to move public opinion, if I have to try to convince the public, like a lot of you guys are getting surgeries that aren't so effective, and I have to challenge a group that you trust, that is maybe not the best move for me as a re-election-oriented politician. Yeah?
What do you think about the politics of, I guess I'm wondering if there is an opening for a policy entrepreneur that's based on the regional variation in doctor practices. So I'm thinking, like, what if there's a Democratic senator or something who's really interested in this and wants to really target not their own state, some egregious thing that is just concentrated in a different state, that's safer for that person to be spearheading.
I will come to a positive use of regional. I think it's hard with problems like, heart or cancer or diabetes or arthritis to find, broad problems that don't sort of affect all patients. But there is a regional angle that I'll come to at the end that I think might be helpful. So we do some studies to look at this. One of them was, we found first of all as a baseline, and this is sort of depressing for students in public policy schools, and like myself and faculty members, but we have to know this. The public is not like demanding that politicians be effective problem solvers. That is not the main thing the public wants. In a 2015 survey, we found just 23% of respondents said they were a great deal more likely to vote for a politician who was a genuine expert in a policy area that's important to the nation as a whole, but not of special importance to their district. That's 45% of respondents said they were not at all or only a little bit more likely to vote for such a politician. And one of the things we don't see is we do not see a lot of politicians getting involved in like the knee surgery debates. Now you might think, well, why? We should. After all, your Medicare is spending a lot of money on that stuff, right? That's your taxpayer dollars. Why aren't we seeing politicians sort of make an issue about this? We rarely see that. And so we're looking here in some ways at off the equilibrium path behavior in the survey experiments to try to explain the dog that doesn't bark. Why is it that we mostly do not see a lot of politicians involved with this? So in this example survey experiment, we described a study in a leading peer-reviewed medical journal that questions the effectiveness of a heart disease procedure. And the next one had to do with the use of prostate tests for prostate cancer screening. We randomly assigned the stances of doctors and members of Congress supporting or opposing the study findings, so arguing that this procedure should be used less, for example. And then we were looking at two kinds of outcomes. Does the public think that the procedure should be used less? And how do people rate these different actors when they make these stances about it? So the bottom line of this survey experiment we found is public opinion about the use of the procedures is affected by the stances of doctors and members of Congress. So if doctors say, for example, here's this study, and that says we should use this heart procedure less, and they oppose the study, that can move opinion. And actually, members of Congress, if they come out in this experiment, that can move opinion as well. But this is the key thing. When the stances of politicians and doctors conflict, the politicians have no independent ability to move public opinion. The influence of the doctors just swamps whatever effect they can have. And this is even more important for them, why we don't see politicians involved. If a politician gets on the wrong side of the doctors, even if the science is on the politician's side. So if the politician came out and said, we're doing too many knee surgeries for these people, here's the New England Journal of Medicine, but the orthopedists say, no, we think there's still a lot of patients, not only will the public not be persuaded that we're doing too many knee surgeries, the public will say, I don't like that politician. Because the public, the low information voter, is saying any politician who's opposed by doctors who's taking the other side, that's not a good person. I don't want that kind of person, right? So it's not a very good move for politicians. Yes, Kathleen.
So what do you think would, I mean, I know this is
you're just guessing in some ways, but what if people think the doctors are in disagreement about something? So
Oh,
in
conflict
many
within?
ways, yeah, so like what if, like how do you think people would respond? So you're talking about you think some of the opportunity for change is some leadership from within the medical profession. So
Yeah.
would people respond differently to something like that if they thought the doctors didn't have a monolithic?
It's a good hypothesis. Yeah. We didn't test that, but breaking up the sort of, the monopoly of authority of the medical profession by creating reform movements within the medical profession perhaps could change dynamics. It's a good suggestion to test. This is what this shows. It's basically the last two are the most important, where you're not seeing any independent political influence of the politician. And the politician's support will fall. It's about how good a job the public thinks that member of Congress is doing if they're on the other side of the doctor, even if the science is on the politician's side. And same thing with the PSA tests. Okay, the decision-making stage. Remember, the first thing I said was for 30 years we didn't see very much effort around this, and then it does get on the agenda via the Obama administration, and then the issue becomes very politicized, where Republicans start opposing it, even though they themselves had supported it. And so we did some interviews with some Republican staffers, congressional staffers in Washington. And I asked one of them, I said, help me understand. Like, you guys think we are wasting a ton of money on Medicare. You want to reduce spending. You want to lower taxes. Your experts have been saying that American medicine is really inefficient, and you have been supporting efforts to make American healthcare more efficient over time. Why did you attack these provisions in the Affordable Care Act? And what I will never forget, what the Republican staffer said to me, and this is how it all got caught up. He said, you have to understand, for us, the Affordable Care Act, which was, of course, a very redistributive policy, for them, very big government. For us, it's like we were in a knife fight with the Democrats. He said, when you're in the middle of a knife fight, you don't say to your opponent, hey, I like your shirt. You use any argument you can to win. You do anything to win the fight. And the Republicans knew that rattling the American public around denial of medical care was a very, very effective move, and to create the perception that death panels and all of that was a really, really good move. So we have had a lot of polarization for sure, but the other thing that I think is really important, this is Francis Lee's work, is we just have a really competitive political system right now. The two parties, there's like a virtual parity of partisan competition. Either party can win almost any election, and when you're in that dynamic, that you're so closely divided, you have an incentive to try to undermine policy ideas for strategic reasons, even if you don't have an ideological disagreement with them. So it's not surprising that Republicans don't like the taxes in the Affordable Care Act, or they think it's too redistributive. But why do we see, partisan conflict over even these diffuse benefit, good government policies like using information to make American healthcare more effective? John Zaller from UCLA up the block talked about the role of experts in problem solving. There's a kind of social learning process historically where, policy experts you get ideas and it diffuses down to politicians, and then it diffuses down to ordinary voters. But that kind of dynamic doesn't take into account this polarization and hyper-competition. When the majority party feels compelled to go it alone, like the Obama administration did on the ACA, the minority party has a strong incentive to discredit the claims and analyses offered by the other party. So even if you have an expert consensus, like all the healthcare economists think our system has a problem, that could still lead to this partisan disagreement because of these political incentives. And an expert consensus may not unify politicians and the public around a course of action. So this breakdown in elite-led social learning, I think, is really important. We talk a lot about how our current political process is not working so well. A lot of the political science is on gridlock, like just passing fewer laws. But I actually think this is in some ways, a more subtle problem that it's getting harder and harder. You can think of climate change or other areas. It's harder and harder to depoliticize issues, even where there's expert consensus on like a scientific issue, even when it's not a value-based issue like gay marriage or redistribution. We're still seeing partisan disagreement, and because the incentives for disagreement are so sharp. What can we do? Well, if we're going to move forward, first of all, we'll see if PCORI gets reauthorized. I don't know. I think it has a chance if the Democrats take the House. The opposition has always been a little bit more in the House, so maybe they'll be able to survive and throw funding into a reconciliation bill. We'll see. But one of the most important things, if you're going to build support, is this can't be about cost cutting. You're not going to build public support for this. This has to be about better medicine. So, PCORI, I think, did not read Dan Carpenter's book about how to build reputations among agencies. They're headed by fine people, but it's not. I see no evidence that they had a political strategy. So one of the first things they should have done, for example, would have been find examples and fund studies of underused treatments and show how some doctors are not doing enough for patients to try to convince the public we need better information to get better medicine, to de-link the idea of science from just cost control. Perhaps if the ACA debate finally fades, it hasn't entirely yet, but maybe there'll be some opportunity to gain bipartisan buy-in. They have to somehow, the public has not heard of PCORI. Nobody knows about this. I don't think there's been a single front-page New York Times article about a study that PCORI has funded since it's been created. I can't think of one study that's gotten national media attention.
PCORI, they go around and they say we're an independent institution.
Independent nonprofit, non-governmental.
You say, well, one thing that matters here is cost.
Yeah.
That's part of your motivation. And you say to them, why don't you look at cost? And they say, well, Congress mandated that we can't.
Right.
So how are you an independent agency, but then Congress tells you what to do? They suffer from a crisis of leadership, in my view. And actually, very relevant to what you're finding, you talk about the influence of doctors. If you look at the people who've led PCORI and AHRQ, more so AHRQ, what you find is the people who were PhDs could not get in to see the members of Congress, but the people who were MDs actually could get appointments. And so even in Congress, you see the influence of doctors.
Yeah, so doctors could be, the current head of PCORI is a doctor. So on the one hand, that's good, but what it did not do is help depoliticize the issue on a partisan basis. So, I don't know if she would have taken it, but if somebody like Gail Walensky, who had headed the CMS under George H.W. Bush and had been John McCain's healthcare advisor, she had been the leading proponent of creating an agency like this. She was a Republican health economist. Strategically, it would have been better to show the world this is not a Democratic issue, right? We could have both experts associated with both parties agree about this. And so it missed that. Now, you mentioned earlier the regional issue. One thing that I think might have worked better is they created a Washington agency, the PCORI. Now, granted, they give money all over the place, but it didn't do anything to build support among members of Congress. Maybe a better model, just a thought experiment, would have been not had an agency like PCORI, but had the North Carolina Institute for Cardiology in North Carolina that would have tried to build support among that delegation for funding for heart surgery. And then in Alabama, you have one for arthritis, and one for California, you have cancer, and so on. You do the kind of thing the VA and other agencies have done, that you create buy-in among delegations. And so it isn't just a Washington-based agency. Having another Washington bureaucracy just giving out money did not really embed the idea of medical practice and connect it to local medical schools around the country. We have all these medical schools, right? And that's a federated design, and they all have popularity with their members of Congress, with local business people. What if we were sending, hundreds of millions of dollars to each of them to build up support around different diseases and so on? Maybe some Republican members in those areas would have been pleased to accept the funding.